Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, wherever you're joining us from around the world. My name is Timon McPherson. I'm an assistant or associate professor of urban ecology and director of the Urban Systems Lab at the New School. This is in New York City, and I have the distinct honor to facilitate this session, so it's really great to have everyone here. It's early in New York, it's late in other parts of the world, so again, thank you from wherever you're joining from. And soon you'll probably see the sunrise come up on my face during our talk. So why are we here? The benefits of nature and nature-based solutions for cooling down hot cities, for providing stormwater absorption, which helps reduce surface flooding in our cities when it's raining, and other of these kind of weather and climate events are becoming very well known at this point. Cities all around the world are planting trees, they're passing legislation, they're incentivizing economic investment in green roofs and other of these nature-based solutions, including ecological restoration and so much more. During the COVID pandemic, studies like the one we recently completed for the US are showing that people are relying on parks and open space to recover mentally and emotionally from the stress of the pandemic. And it seems, among many other things, that we're learning from the current crisis that we need nature in cities for our mental and our physical health. And this has been less explored than some of these other climate benefits. So with the majority of people living in cities and urban areas, when we talk about public health, it means we have to talk about how improving the livability of our cities can be a public health agenda. Not only most people, but most infrastructure and economic productivity is homed in cities. So when climate-driven extreme events strike, from fire and drought to storms and heat waves, cities are where we need the most solutions. So today we have an impressive lineup of experts to discuss with you the nexus between urban nature, climate change adaptation and solutions for climate change, and our health and how we can bring these areas together to build resilience in our urban areas. As part of ICLEI's Daring Cities 2020, today's session will include opening remarks from Ingrid Kotze to situate today's session in the context of the Daring Cities series of events. And I'll introduce her in just a moment. Then we'll hear from two case studies on the topic, including from Peter Massini, Lead for Green Infrastructure for the Greater London Authority, Livia Silva, she's a technical analyst at the municipality of São José de Campos in Brazil. This will be followed by reflections from our panelists, including Harriet Bulkley from Durham University in the UK and co-coordinator of the Naturevation Project, then from David Maddox, founder and executive director of the Nature of Cities in New York, and finally from Peter Massini as well. And after that, after we hear from these amazing experts, I'll ask the panelists a question. We'll bring them on as a full panel and then open the door to questions from the floor. So let me give you a little bit of an overview of how this will run so that you can participate as much as you can. So we'll have short presentations, as I mentioned, and I'll be keeping speakers on time so that we can have as much time for discussion with the audience as we can. We'll try not to run over, of course. This is an hour long event, but even if we do, the plan will be that we'll post the recording of this online soon after today. Please, for those in the audience, please use the Q&A function in the webinar here for asking questions from the speakers. We will be monitoring that Q&A, so put your questions there. We'll be pulling a selection of these that I will ask to the panelists once we get to that part of the event. You can also use the chat to discuss amongst yourselves, to make comments, to engage with the other audience members. We won't monitor that so much for questions. We'll stick to the Q&A section. So again, feel free to use the chat during the event, but please make use of the Q&A area within the webinar here. Finally, I suspect there'll be questions that we won't have enough time to answer. So don't let that stop you from asking questions. Please do. What we'll try to do is answer those questions separately and post answers to questions online together with the recording from this event. So I think that covers most of the logistics for this. Let's get us started. I want to welcome first from ICLEI, Ingrid Kotze, who is the Senior Program Manager at ICLEI City Biodiversity Center in South Africa. Ingrid, thanks so much for welcoming us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Timon. And I'm just going to say a few words about ICLEI and then Daring Cities. So ICLEI, for those people that don't know, is a global network of almost 2,000 local and regional governments, and they focus obviously on sustainable development. We have 22 offices worldwide, and we are active in more than 1,000 countries. And we focus a lot on policy as well as practice interventions with cities and regions. We have 5 pathways, interconnected pathways, along which we focus most of our work. And these are a low emission development pathway, there's a nature development pathway, there's one on circular development. The 4th one focuses specifically on resilience development. And then the last one speaks to equitable and people-centered development. Just something very quickly on Daring Cities so that we can get to our speakers and our panel discussion. Daring Cities has been created by ICLEI and the City of Bonn as a virtual action-orientated global forum or platform on climate change for urban leaders, where we're gathering urban leaders from all over the world as they tackle the climate emergency, particularly within the context of COVID. And it's about recognizing and empowering those courageous urban leaders, including mayors, decision makers, technical staff, researchers, and also the private sector and academics that cities engage with. And the idea is to get away from the business as usual and shift it towards a more business unusual type of approach. And in Daring Cities has been taking place over the past just over 2 weeks. It ends this week on the 28th, and we've had a number of very, very interesting sessions. And for those that would like more information, we'll place the link again in the chat box. Thank you so much, Timon.
Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you for setting the context for this. So I'd like to invite our first speaker, Peter Massini, to join us. Peter has spent the majority of his 30-year professional career as an urban ecologist and green infrastructure policymaker. For the past 10 years, he's led on green infrastructure and natural environment policy for the Greater London Authority, successfully embedding a policy framework in the London Plan and the London Environment Strategy that aims to make London a greener, more livable, and really resilient city. So Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. We really look forward to hearing your thoughts and presenting a little bit of a case study in this global north context in London. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'll be swift, trying to cover some slides. Just explaining about what we're doing in London. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about a bit about context of London, the history of London, which is quite relevant, but also how our policy framework in London is trying to grapple with this issue of becoming a denser, greener, and healthier city, which seems a bit of a conundrum, but we think we've got a policy framework in place that can help us to achieve that. So next slide, please. So it's worth saying that the first public parks in London were actually created for public health. This is Victoria Park that was created in the late 19th century, and it was designed and created specifically to provide open space for the poor of London, people living in slums in London, to allow them to get fresh air and exercise on their day off. Not entirely altruistic, it was done to ensure they could work longer and have longer working lives, but it was initially a public health intervention. Next slide. And then rolling on 50 years, just after the Second World War, the first County of London plan was put together, which set out a planning plan for London. And you can see on this slide that the open space plan was central to the development and regeneration of London post-war. And the dark green areas on here are actually proposed new green spaces, a network of linked and connected spaces that allowed for recreation, for walking, and allowing people to get into nature from the city. Next slide, please. So London today is a growing city, currently 8 million people. We expect to have 12 million people by 2050. And that city has to become much denser than it is now. We can't spread outwards anymore. We have to become more dense. But we also have to address issues around maintaining that access to green space, which has been a hallmark of London for for decades. Next slide, please. And dealing with the modern challenges of a future city. Things like air pollution, which has been a critical issue in London. Next slide. And the impacts of climate change, which not only have health impact, they have an economic impact. Many businesses in London now are very worried about the impact of climate change, particularly in central London, where it becomes unpleasant to travel during the heat of the summer. Next slide, please. So what are the sort of things we're doing in London to try and combat that, to try and create this healthier, denser, but greener city? Some of the things we can do are to improve our existing green spaces. We can take existing areas of green space which don't perform particularly well and rewild them, recreate rivers to create a much more aesthetically pleasing green space, but also a green space that combats flooding and provides a whole range of protections and environmental enhancements and better for biodiversity. So these are sort of things we can do in most of our parks in London, recreating sort of natural environments that are good for health and good for biodiversity. Next slide, please. Perhaps the biggest area of potential is rethinking our street network. And there's a huge change in the way we think and design streets in London now. This is just one example in one of our town centres, which used to be a very busy, car-dominated street. We can repurpose and transform that space into a greener piece of public realm. It still functions as a thoroughfare, but with much reduced traffic and with greening and with pedestrianisation to make it into a civic space rather than a thoroughfare. Next slide, please. And one of the big policy shifts in London over the last 5 years has been driven by air pollution to try and reduce traffic, but increasingly another public health issue, which is active travel, encouraging lots more people to walk and cycle. That reduces motor traffic and reduces air pollution, but importantly also encourages physical activity and reducing issues around things like obesity, which is another big health challenge in London. And for the last 20 years in London, we've done a lot to improve the quality of our housing stock, our public housing stock, to make sure that they aren't damp, to make sure that they're sufficiently ventilated and sufficiently improved to maintain the comfortable living environments. But in the last few years, we've also thought about the exterior to those buildings, how we make use of that green space between buildings to improve public health and improve nature. So next slide. Thank you. Recognizing those spaces between buildings are part of the living space of people. So creating community gardens, creating allotments, creating food growing areas, which do a huge amount in terms of health and well-being and encouraging community cohesion. So taking these policies together, we can start creating new neighbourhoods in London which incorporate greening, incorporate things like green roofs, create areas for active travel, much more walking and cycling, to fundamentally rethink a city so it does become denser, greener and healthier. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to the questions and the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. It's really great to hear a little bit of what's been going on in London. This is not adequate time to really dig into a whole range of things that are happening in the London context and greater regional context there. We want to switch directions a little bit to Brazil. And so I'm going to introduce our next speaker who will present a case study there, Livia Silva. Livia is a technical analyst and civil servant at the Urbanism and Sustainability Department of the São José dos Campos City Hall. She's responsible there for developing municipalities' climate change initiatives and policies, including the first greenhouse gas inventory and the climate risk and vulnerability assessment. Since 2018, she's been working for integrating sustainability and climate with several other local policies, especially the ones relating to the master plan, the urban planning, land use and law, and urban drainage. So Livia, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking some time to be here with us. And we'd love to hear a little bit more about the work that you've been doing in the Brazilian context. Thanks.
Hi, thank you, Paul, Timo. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Clay, for this invitation. I'm really proud to be here with you today. And it's an honor to talk a little bit about San Jose, which is the city that you can see on this map. Next slide, please. So getting closer, San Jose is located between the two largest and most urbanized regions in Brazil, which are São Paulo and Rio. And it's crossed by Paraíba do Sul River, which supply water to millions of people. A few years ago, we had serious droughts, which are expected to be more frequent in the near future due to the climate change. Next slide, please. So on one hand, we need to conserve our natural resource in the rural area, include water for sure, for which we have some initiatives such as the satellite monitoring program and a pilot project of payment for environment service. Next, please. On the other hand, we need to provide a quality of life to almost all of more than 700,000 urban citizens. Next, please. So giving a brief explanation about our urbanization process, it became more intensive in the 50s when this large highway connecting Rio and São Paulo was built and the aerospace sector started to be developed, attract other industries like this refinery, which is the third largest in Brazil. It means that although the city is known as a pool of innovation, for many years, San Jose has been only an industrial city and a good place for working. So think about the Nexus. This urban development has created a lot of challenges in terms of health, especially air pollution, climate, and nature. Next, please. So because of it, nowadays we have a really disconnected and monocentric cities. And besides, the central and infrastructure areas are still losing population in a sprawling process, resulting in a huge amount of GHG emissions associated with transport. To deal with this, our master plan has proposed a compact, multifunctional, and polycentric city. Next, please. And this year, COVID came showing us that we need to make San Jose more livable and more sustainable, which can also be a great opportunity. Once San Jose offers a strategic location and better quality of life for people and companies who want to live big cities such as Rio and São Paulo. Next, please. So just to show what's happening in the city right now, we are improving our cycling infrastructure, include bike lanes in all new roads, and try to adapt them into the consolidated city, which sometimes conflicts with trees, power poles, and sidewalks. As a consequence, even though we are encouraging a more sustainable mobility, it doesn't mean that we are managing to deliver green and healthy space all the time yet. Next, please. And this year, we also finished upgrading all the street lighting to LED with more than 7,000 lamps. And connect with the Nexus, it's a great mitigation action that provides much safer place and help to reduce the rejection to tree and green space, especially in poor and peripheric areas. In this sense, I also highlight the tree census project, which is mapping all street trees and puts these QR codes to engage people about the value of the trees in city. Next, please. Then this is the Linha Verde or Green Line project, which is ongoing, and it will replace this energy transmission line that you can see on the first picture by a sustainable mobility system, providing electric public mass transport to the highest population density areas and helping to reduce the air pollution and GHG emissions. It will also create new bike lanes, green space, and other sustainable elements. Next, please. About the urban drainage, based on the first stage of our plan, we've realized that gray infrastructure will not be enough to deal with the storm water management. Because of it, we have already proposed a second stage for the next year, in which we intend to go deep into the blue and green infrastructure and learn how to implement them in our city context and how to integrate them into the urban space and protect areas. Next, please. To finalize, as an example of this approach, we return to the Paraíba do Sul River and its floodplain known as Banhado, which is a great urban protect area. So here, our intention is to create new parks and connect them with the existing one in a kind of urban stitching. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Livia. It was really excellent. Amazing things are happening there. Thanks so much for sharing. Now I want to turn to our panelists, which I'll introduce together and we'll bring on together to some extent respond to the case studies, but also to take us to a more global comparative urban context. So I want to start by introducing all three. First, Harriet Bulkley. Harriet Bulkley is an accomplished and respected scholar with expertise on nature-based solutions, especially in urban contexts. She's a professor in the Department of Geography at Durham University in the UK, and coordinator of the Naturevation Project, a multi-year, multinational research initiative that I'm sure she'll tell you more about. David Maddox is also joining us from New York City. David loves urban spaces and nature, and also creativity and collaboration, meaning he also loves theater and music. This has been an important part of his life. He worked at the Nature Conservancy on climate change and stewardship for many years, but in 2012, he founded the Nature of Cities, a transdisciplinary essay and discussion platform with over 800 writers from around the world, including scientists to activists and designers to artists. Peter Massini will also give us some general reflections, who I've introduced before as the lead for green infrastructure for the Greater London Authority. So Harriet, let's start with you. We'll have each of you give about 5 minutes response, and then I'll ask you some questions. We'll bring on Livia as well back to discuss, and then we'll open this up to audience questions. So I'll just remind before you start, Harriet, to the audience here, please put your questions in the chat. We'll monitor that, and I will ask as many as I can of the panelists while we have time. Harriet, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Lovely to be here today. I've just prepared a few slides actually to just help me comment a little bit on what we've heard. I think we saw in the two examples just how many things are happening in cities at the moment that in one way or another involve trying to work through this nexus challenge of how do we address, climate, nature, health simultaneously. I just wanted to share a few of the sort of general findings we found from the Naturevation project to kind of put some of these cases in context, and then I'll say a couple of words at the end. So if I could have the next slide, please. So, what we noticed very much is that there's a very strong move towards this idea that nature-based solutions can be a way of trying to navigate this nexus. And certainly lots of the examples that we just saw show us that this is, happening on the ground and happening in so many cities around the world now. What we're finding in our project is that, we can definitely see that multiple benefits are being generated, but nonetheless, these remain quite diverse, quite unevenly distributed. They're actually often unrecognized and they can be difficult to capture. So that tells us something about what are going to be the challenges of mainstreaming or scaling things up from the kinds of examples that we have now. This was put nicely to me by a partner in the Environment Agency that we're working with here in the UK, who is saying that recognizing the benefits is one thing, Harriet, but actually finding the beneficiaries is another. Those people who are likely to benefit from nature-based solutions might not even, recognize that on a day-to-day basis they are involved in capturing those benefits, and engaging those different and diverse groups is also a challenge. And we also, I think, have to recognize, as colleagues who've been working on the project and of course elsewhere globally are increasingly saying, that nature-based solutions can also bring with them increasing unevenness in development, and can sometimes, they're not considered, these issues are not considered in advance, serve to widen inequalities, with some people having access to their benefits and not others. Can I have the next slide, please? So this, what we've tried to do in the project, and I think, what I saw in the two presentations as well, is really trying to be sensitive about what kinds of nature-based solutions can generate what kinds of benefits to which different kinds of groups. And this is about recognizing their co-benefits, recognizing how different kinds of sustainability goals, so like perhaps how improving housing can lead to other kinds of sustainability challenges being addressed as well. And particularly, it was really welcomed our colleague from Brazil sharing with us the different kinds of co-benefits that they're evaluating or thinking about in relationship to each of the projects that they're putting forward. And we can see just from this graph produced by my colleagues in the project that different kinds of nature-based solutions hit different sustainability goals to a different level. And so then it becomes about the combination of the different interventions that you're doing if you want to kind of realize multiple sustainability goals at once. Next slide, please. And then, you know, when we looked at, well, so how are people trying to realize these values, capture them, and put these into practice at wider scale? And we use the idea of a business model, but we don't necessarily mean that businesses are involved or that it's going to be something that necessarily generates a profit, but it's more a question of how do you identify and capture value, which is what a business model tends to try to do. And we find that there are lots of different kinds of business models being advanced to try to capture these multiple benefits. But usually one such model is not enough in any project, and you need several there present. So you might want to involve stakeholders who are interested in the benefits of risk reduction, together with those who are interested in green densification, together with health benefits. And then you have to bring those multiple different actors together in order to get projects working on the ground. Next slide, please. So this slide just shows some of the other business models that we've found that are working in practice. But as I say, most of them are working jointly with other kinds of business models. And so that speaks to something about, you know, in both the cases that we looked at, there's really been a very strong level for the municipal government. And in, you know, both, you know, should be commended for the level of engagement they've had. But of course, not all cities have the resources or the capacities to do that. And so these business models become really important when we're thinking about different kinds of partnership models, which different kinds of actors we're going to need to get around the table. Next slide, please. And just, you know, this is a work in progress in too many boxes. So, you know, just forgive us for an initial sketch diagram of something that we're looking at the moment, is that when it comes to how we then try to mainstream nature-based solutions, we can really see that there are different drivers pushing the agenda, depending on whether you're coming at it from a climate change angle, a biodiversity angle, or a health angle. And some of the key, if you like, what we call them in the project stepping stones or leverage points, which are going to be most effective for mainstreaming nature-based solutions for climate change, for example, which would be about involving those communities who are interested in mitigating risk, the insurance sector, you know, public sector, utilities, and so on. They're not so interested in the biodiversity elements. And then you've got planners and conservationists and others who are more interested in the biodiversity elements. And sometimes, you know, these communities don't know about each other, different nature-based solutions being implemented by different kinds of communities in the same city. And if you like, the pathways for mainstreaming nature-based solutions still remain quite siloed, with only maybe a few stepping stones that are being used that cut across these. So one of the things we're trying to do at the moment is trying to think about where are the integrated pathways for mainstreaming nature-based solutions and how can we use these multiple drivers to go forward. So I'll leave it there, but just to say that I think, you know, the presentation showed us just how much cities can do, but also how sort of negotiating and working out who do you need around the table to really benefit from this kind of nexus benefits that a nature-based solution can deliver is one of the challenges I think we need to tackle. Thank you.
Thank you, Harriet. And we already have some questions coming in the Q&A box on some of these points. So we'll get to those when we get to the panel discussions, but I definitely want to pick up on this complexity and how do we sort of reduce unintended consequences and really sort of work across the nexus. David, it'd be great to hear from you and your perspective on this as well. Thanks for joining, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation, and I'm glad to be heard in this context. A number of things that we've been hearing so far today I find are really inspirational. And Timon mentioned that I spent many years in theater, and one of the things that was important about the idea of theater to me was the idea of collaboration, that through collaboration we can create something we could not have created by ourselves. And that's fundamental into the idea of a nexus and how do we build a city from multiple points of view, multiple ways of knowing, multiple modes of action. That's what Peter talked about, that's what Livia talked about, that's what Harriet just talked about. And one of the things that I want to emphasize is something that Peter mentioned, the idea of the space between buildings. That space between buildings is not only green space, not only functional space, not only space that provides benefits of various kinds, it's also a public square. It's a space for dialogue in which we can have these conversations about the kind of cities we want. We can have the conversations across these different points of view, because we know that we like our disciplines, right? We like to inhabit our disciplines. We were trained in them. They're comfortable. We like the people in the disciplines. But we also have a language in that discipline that means, the words mean something, but what you immediately realize is the words don't mean the same thing when you're trying to talk to someone else. We had a roundtable not long ago at the Nature of Cities, which put together ecologists and landscape architects, fellow travelers in professions, right? Then we asked them, what do the words mean to you? And it turns out the words mean, none of the words mean the same thing. Words like wild don't mean the same thing between ecologists and landscape architects. Words like evidence don't mean the same thing. So if such fellow traveler professions don't share the same words, then we can imagine how we might struggle with words like resilience or sustainability or livability or even justice. Those words that exist very comfortably at the level of agreeable metaphor are actually can be very contested at the level of action and planning, and that's where collaboration becomes absolutely essential to making progress. And in that sense, this idea of the green space, the space between buildings, being a public square in which many different points of view can be negotiated and discovered. And in that sense, I'd like to emphasize 3 words about the idea of collaboration, some of which have come up so far today. One of them, the one word is imagination. We have to have an enormous amount of imagination. We have to bring imagination to collaborative conversations. One of the reasons a good friend, Pippin Anderson, wrote about this at the Nature of Cities, in which, why do we have trouble collaborating with people? It's because, in part, because we're trained to know what's true and what's not true. That's evidence, that's not evidence. And so we're actually fundamentally distrustful of a different way of knowing. So you have to have a lot of imagination and imagine someone else's point of view. And second, you have to have a lot of trust. You have to bring an enormous amount of trust and respect to collaborative events, and specifically events in which different types of people are going to be talking with each other. They have different interests, but also they even talk about things differently. They use words differently. And the third is that this also came up in a number of the conversations. I think everyone has mentioned the idea of justice. And I often talk about, when I speak, I might start by saying, do we truly believe in the benefits of ecosystem services? Do we really believe green space is a good idea? Everybody nods their heads and said, yes, of course. Well, then the next question that comes up, that should come up, is, all right, who should get to enjoy the benefits of that green space? Well, the answer is everybody. Does everybody get to enjoy those benefits? No, they do not. And so to me, this idea of collaboration and reaching out across boundaries, across disciplinary boundaries, across social boundaries, across all the boundaries, we need to, everything we do is fundamentally focused through a justice lens. It has to be, because that's the way we'll make better cities that include everybody and that it negotiates among ideas across difference. We need to find out what we can find out in the fuzzy boundaries between points of view. In that sense, we can make better cities for everyone that include everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate your thoughts here. Very important, and we have some questions coming up in the Q&A boxes around this too, which I'm keen to get to. So we'll do that. But first, Peter, I want to give you a chance to respond to all of this as well, to some extent from where you sit within the London context, but I know you participate in discussions, outside of that too. So if you take a few minutes to respond, and then we'll just get into a discussion, all of us, and bring Livia on board as well.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting hearing what David was saying about the sort of narratives and the collaborations we need to put together. So when I first started working in London, I come from an ecology background, and the drive was to protect nature, to protect and enhance wildlife in the city, but with people in mind. And then the climate agenda came along, and that became a driver for what we do. But I've been fascinated over the last year in particular with COVID, how the public health agenda has really come to the fore again, which was the original driver for protection of green space in cities. And it's the public health agenda, to my mind, which is a thing that speaks to everyone. As I say to a lot of my colleagues, not everyone's interested in nature and wildlife. They're shocked by that, but actually not everyone's interested in nature and wildlife. Climate is something that's, to some people, still a difficult concept or a distant concept to grapple with, but public health is something that speaks to all of us. And we thought we'd been doing very well in London in terms of our agenda around nature-based solutions and green infrastructure, you know, our ability to protect parks, our ability to green the urban environment. But it wasn't until COVID came along that we realized that we hadn't been doing enough in terms of social justice and public health. You know, those benefits weren't evenly distributed. And even if you can create new parks in dense parts of the city, which is quite difficult, not everyone uses parks every day. You know, you need to create nature-based solutions and green infrastructure into the spaces that everyone uses every day. So it is the street network, it is the walk to school, it is where you go to shop. So that whole thinking now about particularly changing the nature of our street network to create areas of greener public space is a real driver for a lot of the projects now, but a very difficult thing to deal with, because you know, we've designed and developed our cities around cars and lorries and vehicles, and to shift away from that is a huge challenge and a very difficult thing to fundamentally change the nature of those spaces. But I think it's something that's gaining a lot of momentum now, and many cities around the world are now recognizing that it's that space which is the space you need to fundamentally change if you want to address this issue around public health, climate, and nature.
Thank you, Peter. And I'm going to invite Livia to put your video on as well and join us. I prepared a whole list of questions, but many have come into the chat, and I just want to go, or rather in the Q&A box, distinct from the chat box. I want to go straight to them. So let's just pick up on some of the points that you mentioned, the need to put people first in nature-based solutions. We're seeing this agenda in the climate agenda, a very mobilized voice around putting people first in climate change adaptation. When we talk about public health, it seems sort of implicit that people are first there. But when we think about the role of justice, and as you put it, Peter, you know, there's been different agendas, sort of a biodiversity conservation agenda, a climate resilience agenda, a social justice agenda is coming online. And David, as you said, shouldn't that be where we start? So I'm just kind of curious, maybe we can talk for a few minutes with a little more specifics. How do we put people first? How do you sort of navigate this complexity? And maybe you could even give an example from a project. So I'm going to one of the questions that we had early on in the chat from Charmaine, who was asking about this social dimension. And so when you're greening a street, when you're, you know, planning housing development with green roofs and a new community garden, what is the way to do this, to really bring people's ideas and attitudes in this spirit of collaboration and build trust? What are some cases that are working, or at least what have you learned that you shouldn't do next time? And I'll open the floor. Maybe we could start with Harriet.
Thanks very much. I think one of the things that we've seen, which is really an interesting approach here, is allowing for some kind of temporary retaking of different spaces in the city. So we've seen this across different kinds of cities that we've been working on, particularly in Barcelona and in Leipzig, where two of the sets of teams who are working on the project together are based. And they're providing this kind of space in between buildings and sites which are derelict or waiting for redevelopment, street sites as well, and giving those over to local groups and community groups for temporary kinds of installations where they get to kind of, if you like, try out, experiment with different kinds of natures and different kinds of uses that they enjoy and want, and having diversity in that, so different groups will do different things, and then allowing that to provide a basis for developing further collaborations with institutional actors who can implement things seems to be one way of doing it. So really sort of starting with something quite hands-on. I mean, there is also, I'm sure, you know, for larger project where there's a lot of money and investment going in, a process of kind of more planning and design and collaboration and thinking and drawing together different knowledges, but that can be quite long in its process. And so some kind of like getting your hands dirty, getting your hands green, doing stuff straight away can be important. I think it's also important, one of our researchers is currently based in China, And she reminds me that the discourse about access to nature during the COVID pandemic has not been one that is prevalent in Chinese cities at all, because their lockdown and their release has been completely different. And so, you know, while I think this has been an experience for many urban communities, it's also important not to universalize what works and what doesn't work, and what will trigger these different things in different places. So it's really going with that grassroots, as David said also, and Peter in their talks as well, I think, and seeing what's working in that community and trying to build on what's already there.
Yeah, that's great. It's something we've seen a lot in the US context as well, this goal for us to share best practices and to say, okay, we figured it out, everyone can do it. And in the local context is about local people, and they have their own ideas. David or Peter, Olivia, do you want to jump in on this?
So I just want to add something that for here in Brazil is really strong, because it's a really an equal country, and here the violence is something that, for sure, São José is not the worst city in Brazil. Here is a really good city, but we have a lot of difficulty to implement green areas in these poor areas and give an access for them. This is why I highlight the levy as an instrument to reduce this rejection.
Thank you, Olivia. David?
I would amplify just briefly two words in what was just said. One is one good one and one bad one. And that one is the idea of diversity, and in this case, diversity of different kinds of spaces. We know that we can have different forms of things, some of which are good open space, some of which are good for ball fields, some of which are good for having a picnic, and some of which are good for biodiversity. And we can have all of those things. Jane Jacobs talked about that originally, the idea of a sidewalk being multiple different types of spaces. And the bad word for me is a word that the European Commission likes to use a lot, and that is the word dissemination, which it really bugs me as a word, and because it's all one way. What we want to do is engage people about these ideas, not disseminate to them about those ideas.
Thank you, David. That's very important. Peter?
I just wanted to sort of follow up on something that Harriet was saying about, and it's one of the big challenges we have as a city authority and London boroughs as authorities, how to do sort of tactical interventions which are potentially temporary, could be changed over time. It's quite challenging for a city authority or a transport authority to do temporary installations or tactical interventions. That's what community can do really well. And experiment and trial things to see how they work. As a consequence of COVID, we're actually doing a lot of tactical stuff in London now, because we've had to use a variety of powers to put in changes to street layouts to enable social distancing. So we've done lots and lots of temporary changes to street layouts, to layouts of public spaces to enable social distancing. And that's allowed now a conversation about, could these become permanent? Should they become permanent? If they do become permanent, how might we do it differently? But it throws up lots and lots of significant issues in terms of traffic being directed to different parts of the city, which may have an adverse impact on areas which are don't have a vocal community arguing for improvements to their public space. So it's an interesting challenge between how you grapple with community-led projects, which might be certain communities with the most vocal ability to promote their agenda, and how city government or local authorities referee or mediate those discussions. We haven't got any answers yet, but we're trying.
I don't think any of us expects you to answer this for everyone in the world, right? This is a tough challenge. In New York City recently, just this past summer, a new environmental justice advisory board was created and set up to advise the mayor's office on a whole range of things. I find that like very good. But it's just 2020, right? So you sort of wonder, where have we been for the last couple of decades? But so there are steps in the right direction. I think we're all sort of struggling with, how do you do this in the context of financing often flows top down, right? A number of decisions, like you're mentioning, Peter, in the context of COVID, where we're rapidly putting in social distancing mechanisms, and those tend to be top down, right? How do you bring this engagement model that we all know is absolutely central to just participation, right? Because it's not only who gets the benefits, it's the process. Any good ideas or things you've seen that are inspiring around that, of bringing these what seem to be conflicting, kinds of goals, this engaged, bottom-up, diverse participation with the need to sort of rapidly deploy a top-down strategy, or financing coming, particularly in that way. David, I see your hand up, so feel free to jump in as a start.
Yeah, a good friend and colleague, architect PK Das in Mumbai, has done many projects like this, and one of the remarkable things he said to me once is that one of the things he has to do when he comes into a public meeting is check his profession at the door to some extent, because as you said, there's no buzzkill like a plan. Where you come in and drop a plan on them, and people go, oh, okay, well, I guess this is done. And there's some sort of fizzy place in the middle between engaging people and providing opportunities. So structured conversation towards solutions seems really important. And that's I would do a shout out to a lot of the European Commission projects like Harriet's, also Connecting Nature, are also really good at actually trying to find some sort of mixed model of work and planning and research and conversation about some of that work. It's a mixed approach is really strong.
It feels like it's quite experimental. At least that's what I'm kind of observing in a lot of projects in cities around the world. It seems great that we are recognizing this as an issue and experimenting, but maybe I can just pick up on the finance piece here a little bit. We had a question in the chat as well about how does this financing work? And I think maybe it's an interesting question to turn it a little bit. How do we make it work in a way that also recognizes the need for more participatory processes in that? Peter, there was a direct question to you, so maybe you could start on this. That would be great. And Livia, feel free to jump in.
Actually, the finance issue is the one of the biggest challenges. We're working in a project in Southeast London with a big housing provider, trying to find ways of doing co-creation and participatory methods to inform the regeneration of a large housing estate. But the financing is even more top-down and even more rigid in terms of the period in which money's got to be spent. And by its very nature, the co-creation participatory methods are iterative. They're trying to find ways, engaging, first of all, trying to make sure we're actually engaging with those diversity of communities in that area. So it's about how you build in a good 18 months process in advance of making decisions about finance, because if you try to retrofit a co-creation process onto a project which already has milestones and financing in place, it becomes it doesn't work. You're giving sort of false hope to people that they're actually going to influence the outcome. So there's a big issue around how we set up programs and finance them in ways that allows for a front-end process of community consultation or community co-creation, and we haven't thought that through yet and figured out how we do it.
Particularly do you want to pick up on this financing model question a little bit? Sorry, Peter. I'm also hoping I can save time to get to two other big issues that are coming up in the questions about these trade-offs with biodiversity and even coming back to the COVID context. But on the financing model, I think is a really important one for the reasons we've said.
Yeah, I can come in briefly. I mean, I think a lot of actors who currently financially benefit from nature-based solutions in cities are not part of our conversation. So for that, I would put the insurance sector and the utility sector quite centrally. And often in cities, these are actors who are missing from these processes. And when we think about co-production processes or these sort of participatory ground-up processes, we often kind of tend to it's a conversation between communities and municipalities or governmental authorities. but I do think it needs to be more three-way conversation, and to be getting those, you know, financial actors involved in the co-production process from the outset. So it's not just about, you know, and most nature-based solutions in Europe, and particularly in, you know, also in the UK, are financed through municipal budgets or through housing, urban development programs. But the risk in, you know, the insurance sector benefits significantly from whether or not an area has green roofs or not, in terms of like what the flood risk damage and the water retention damages are later. It's just that they don't currently, they're not part of the conversations, and they don't, you know, adjust their premiums and other things accordingly. But we are starting to see some of those kinds of models being established, particularly in the Netherlands, and the insurance sector is now increasingly involved in these kind of tripartite conversations. And maybe that's something that you know, European projects and other projects will need to do in the future, is actually broker those much more difficult conversations between actors who seem quite removed from communities as alongside municipalities, I think, to get some of these business models in place. But we could talk about this for a lot longer, so I'll just be quiet.
We could. There's many things to talk about for much longer. I always feel like these are conversations we start, and then there's, you know, there's a long thread that needs to come after. Hopefully we can do a little bit of this online. Livia, feel free to jump in, or just put your hand up so I know if you want to jump in on this. But I want to move us to another topic, even though we're to the last couple minutes, and then I'll close this off, which is thinking about this early, as you called it, phase, Peter, or sort of driver around investments in green space and nature-based solutions for biodiversity conservation. And so Kevin Vega had a question here about the role of native species. And I guess I would generalize it a bit and to say, how is this working when you think about definitions of nature-based solutions, like the IUCN definition, which is, you know, being explored within the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and other places, where benefits for biodiversity are part of the definition of whether or not it's a nature-based solution. Is this working? You know, taking up David Maddox's question or thought that, you know, people don't mean the same thing when they say native species. Probably he used the word wild, but I'm going to put it in the same context. Is there a trade-off? Is it working smoothly? What are you seeing in terms of these sort of entwined agendas of benefiting nature and nature benefiting people? Who wants to jump in? Yeah.
I could say something just very quickly. I mean, I appreciate the work that the IUCN is doing, and I understand why there's a reason to have a biodiversity element for a nature-based solution standard, but I am concerned that it's usually an in situ definition, so that biodiversity has to be delivered right then and there, which would mean that every sort of temporary installation, everything would have to have a kind of biodiversity benefit, rather than what do they collectively add to biodiversity. And for example, what does using green roofs to reduce carbon emissions from buildings then helping to address climate change then add to biodiversity, right? So I think in an urban context, the definitions can be maybe more problematic than the kinds of nature-based solutions that are in place. But colleagues who are actually doing this on the ground, I'm sure, have many more challenges trying to implement it.
A couple other quick responses. So Peter, go ahead.
I agree with Harriet. I mean, it's a debate that sometimes ends up being quite sort of navel-gazing. We sort of argue amongst ourselves around. To me, the most important thing is what's the outcome you're trying to achieve. In certain locations, the outcome won't primarily be a biodiversity outcome, but quite often biodiversity benefits because you're putting in a nature-based solution, and biodiversity will benefit per se. So it's about identifying what is the outcome you're trying to achieve for any particular project, and design your project to achieve that outcome. And sometimes it will be biodiversity as the driver for the project, but not always.
Mm-hmm. I'll just briefly say that in New York, where funding to build green roofs is driven by stormwater mitigation, right? It's about absorbing rainwater. We've seen amazing bird diversity, insect diversity, you know, sort of coming to these spaces because they're new, novel spaces. So I think, you know, these things that come later and how they sort of contribute to the broader network is a really good point. Look, we are out of time. I'm going to ask us to everyone stay on 2 more minutes if you can, because I think there's an important sort of closing point, which is we are in a pandemic. It has not gone away like everyone was hoping it would after 3 months or 6 months. What have you seen in your own cities or in your own cases where you work that helps us to really understand what the needed next steps are when we think about the nexus between health, and we're thinking about health a lot these days. I think the disproportionate impacts of COVID mirror disproportionate impacts of climate change. We're seeing that very strongly in lots of cases. What have you seen recently that sort of is sort of remotivating you, or that you're finding maybe novel or underpinning something that needs to be elevated as a message for how we bring together health as a priority, justice as a priority, as we mentioned, the sort of thread through everything, but also climate resilience? And maybe just a quick response. We'll go around from each one. Thanks. Okay, I'll tell you where to start. David, can you start? Thanks.
Sure. Early on in the pandemic, especially, there was a lot of enthusiasm about nature coming back into cities, lots of wildlife, and I guess one of the things that I want to caution us all to be about is not to be too happy about all of this, because there's so much just immense human carnage involved in in COVID. Employment losses among many communities that we really care about, immigrant communities, poor communities. So it's another plea for us to be very inclusive about the people we're having conversations with, and it's not all about biodiversity. It's not all about transportation. It's not all about energy. We're actually trying to create a city which is much more multifaceted. And in the COVID sense, we realized we need a new normal, and we hope it's not the old normal, because the old normal was a big part of the problem.
Harriet, and we'll go to Peter and Olivia.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would really echo that. I mean, I think if this is what it would take to have a transition to a low carbon or biodiverse world, it's not one that we should be, celebrating. I mean, some of the aspects of the ways in which communities have come together and different kinds of, ways of living have been important for people, then I think that matters, but not as a way through a transition. I think, one of the things I've been really curious about is that the more and more open space and the space in between buildings and things that people have wanted in certain kinds of contexts through the lockdown. I'm just really intrigued about all the sort of semi-privatized land that there is in cities, and what we can do to try to open that up to make it more of a commons. So, land by railways, land used as school playgrounds, which isn't open over the weekends, the golf courses, whatever it might be. I'm really intrigued about whether this might give us a new drive to try to create more access, whether it's on a temporary basis or not, to those kinds of lands in cities that could really open up what it is that people are able to enjoy in their urban environment.
Yeah, I find it really compelling, some of the temporary ideas that have just been rolled out because we've had to do something, and whether or not some of these can become permanent. So I think that's something that we'll really look forward to see what happens there. Livia, do you want to respond about the COVID context at all? I'll give you a chance, and then Peter, will let you have the last word.
I just agree with them and say that here in São José, people left the shopping mall because it's common here, and go to the green and open space and enjoy that and discover it. And so it's really good to see families again using this public space. And we hope that these things will keep in the future. Yeah.
Thank you, Olivia. Thanks. Peter, a last comment, and then I'll close this out.
Yeah, I think just the as I said before, the health agenda speaks to us all, and I think it's for 30 years working in London around green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. Actually, we forgot the health agenda, and it sort of brought it sharply into focus now, and it's the most compelling argument for a lot of the work we do.
Yeah, I'm glad we're having this discussion today. I think, nature-based solutions, for people who kind of know the trajectory of this, a lot of this has come out of work that we've called, ecosystem services, the benefits of nature to people. And I always found it shocking that, mental health and physical health were never sort of explicitly part of that, right? I think nature-based solutions is a place to sort of bring these together. And in the context of COVID, it couldn't be more paramount or pressing, I think. I want to thank you all. Thank you, Livia. Thank you, Harriet. Thank you, David. Thank you, Peter, for joining us today. We've had a lot of questions that we didn't get to answer come up in the chat. So if you can make an effort to type a few responses, we'll post those online as we post the recording of this. I also want to mention that this questions around nature-based solutions, finance, and health is going to be taken up further next week as part of the Local Climate Solutions for Action local climate solutions for Africa. We'll put a link in the chat, which is just put in there. So please join us for that. And I just want to thank the audience members for holding on with this as we went a few minutes over time. This has been a great discussion. Thank you, everyone. And we hope to see everyone together soon. Take care.